The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing red and blue lights reflecting in the wet pavement, set to the soundtrack of my mother's silent, panicked prayers. It wasn't a cough. It was a failure. My father, Samuel Davis, 78 years old, and tough as forged steel, was suffering. His lungs were shutting down. He had dedicated 60 years to this city, working construction, building the very bridges we drove across. Now, he found himself gasping for breath in the back seat of a late-night taxi, clutching his chest. We rushed into the massive glass doors of Memorial ER at 1:17 a.m. The scent of bleach, desperation, and cheap coffee hit me first, then the relentless noise, the faint beep of monitors, and the strained, heavy silence of people waiting for their lives to be noticed. Mom, Ilara, helped Dad shuffle toward the triage window. He leaned heavily on his mahogany cane, his knuckles white, each shallow breath sounding like tearing paper. He moved with the slow, deliberate fear of a man trying desperately not to show how close he was to breaking. I stood back a few paces, observing. It was instinct. After years in my line of work, I learned that true character and true institutional rot shows itself when the staff thinks no one important is watching. A nurse sat behind the counter, scrolling on a tablet. Her name tag read Peterson. She didn't look up immediately. Her attention was absorbed by data entry for a young woman who was calmly complaining about a sprained ankle. "We need help," Mom whispered, her voice rough with terror. She had already lost her volume, fearing she would become a nuisance. "He can't breathe. Chest pain started 30 minutes ago." Finally, Peterson lifted her eyes. They were cold, tired, and deeply indifferent. She didn't see a critical cardiac patient. She saw two people who looked worn down, stressed, and perhaps disposable. She saw age and skin color, not the acute symptoms. "Wait in line, ma'am," Peterson said, her tone flat, utterly bored. "Everyone here needs help. Fill out the paperwork first." Paperwork, while Dad's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. Mom tried again, leaning over the counter, pleading, dropping her voice to the level of negotiation. "Please, he's never had breathing issues like this. It's acute. He might be having a cardiac event." Peterson sighed, a theatrical display of misused patience. She pointed vaguely at the overflowing waiting room. "Look around, Mrs. Davis. We have 15 critical cases logged right now. You're priority 4. The waiting room is full." I watched, numb with rage, as a well-dressed young man, clearly intoxicated, stumbled in 20 feet away, clutching his shoulder and swearing loudly about a rugby injury. Within 3 minutes, a different nurse whisked him behind the double doors. No paperwork required. Priority 4. That was code 4. You can wait until we have dealt with the people who look like they matter. I stepped forward. I kept my voice level, deliberately professional. My suit jacket was buttoned. My face was a deliberate mask of quiet authority. I didn't want to threaten. I wanted to appeal to their professional duty. "Excuse me, Nurse Peterson," I said, moving smoothly to the counter. "My father is displaying classic signs of unstable angina. He requires an immediate EKG and oxygen supplementation. Delaying assessment in these cases is procedurally negligent." Peterson turned her gaze to me. She saw the suit, the confidence, but she quickly dismissed it. She focused on the context. A black family, demanding immediate attention late at night. She had the power here. "Sir, I appreciate your opinion, but I am the trained medical professional here. I decide the urgency. You are not on staff. If you cause a scene, I'll call security, and your father will still be priority 4. Her face was a mask of cold bureaucratic entitlement. It was the exact same look I had seen in boardrooms, committee meetings, and zoning offices across the state for years. The look of quiet, sanctioned power being wielded carelessly. My father slumped into one of the hard plastic molded chairs, gasping deep, rattling breaths. Mom knelt beside him, rubbing his back, whispering the 23rd Psalm into his ear. The humiliation was visceral. We were invisible. We were a nuisance in our own crisis. I took the mandated forms from Peterson. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that my credentials, my actual institutional power, were useless here because I chose not to brandish them. Not yet. I sat beside my father and began filling out the necessary information: name, address, insurance carrier. Then I came to the crucial box, the one that often required precision and defined who you were in the eyes of the machine. Occupation. I paused, pen hovering over the cheap paper. My father's occupation, retired union shop foreman. My mother's occupation, community volunteer and homemaker. My own occupation. I didn't write down the truth. I didn't write State Senior Health and Compliance Inspector, Region 3. The words I wrote down were simple, understated, self-employed consultant. I wanted them to fail on their own terms, completely unaware of the witness they were providing. For the next 20 agonizing minutes, I watched Peterson ignore my parents, focusing instead on her tablet, ordering coffee, and laughing with the bored security guard standing nearby. The staff shuffled past, avoiding eye contact with the waiting room. This ER was not merely overworked, it was broken. It was sick with institutional rot, treating basic human dignity as a luxury reserved for those who fit their preferred demographic. Mom looked at me, her eyes wet, filled with fear and defeat. Marcus, what are we going to do? I closed the folder, the official paperwork they had insisted upon, and placed it neatly on the plastic seat beside me. I stood up slowly. We are going to find a decent hospital for Dad, Mom, I said, my voice low and steady, filled with a resolve that felt cold in my chest. And then, we are going to fix this hospital, permanently. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout my title. I just looked at the cold, fluorescent hall, memorizing every face, every procedural violation, every cold indifference. I catalogued the sequence of neglect. I helped my parents back into the taxi. It was the most dangerous decision I had ever made, risking my father's health for a principle. But leaving him in the care of people who saw him as disposable felt like a slower, more painful form of violence. We drove away from Memorial ER, the injustice a heavy weight in the air. The ER staff thought they had won. They thought they had seen the last of the tired black family they had dismissed. They had no idea that they hadn't just denied an elderly man a bed. They had unknowingly denied the state of their cooperation. And I had the files and the eyewitness report to begin shutting them down. The next hospital was 20 minutes further. But that wait was worth the poetic justice I was about to deliver. They say time slows down when you need it most. That's a lie. Time speeds up. It rushes past, leaving you stranded, watching the seconds drain the life out of someone you love. We had been sitting in that sterile waiting room for over an hour now. The air conditioning was set too high, but Eleanor was sweating. Her breathing was shallow, hitched every few seconds by a gasp she couldn't stifle. I held her hand. Her skin felt like damp paper. Elijah, my father, was doing his best. He kept standing, walking up to the bulletproof glass window of the triage desk and asking, "Excuse me, ma'am, I know you're busy, but my wife, she's not getting better. Her chest pain is getting worse." The nurse behind the glass, a woman with harsh red hair and a name tag that read Brenda, didn't even look up from her screen. "Mr. Davis, you were checked in. You are category yellow. There are 3 emergencies ahead of you. We will call you." Her voice was monotone, clipped, and devoid of any human empathy. Category yellow, like a forgotten traffic light. I watched Dad shrink back into his chair. He was a man who had built a life, raised 3 children, paid every tax, and mentored half the engineers in the state. Now he was reduced to a pleading, invisible old man. He tried again 10 minutes later. This time he was shaking a little. "Please, ma'am, she is collapsing," he insisted, his voice cracking slightly. Brenda sighed, a theatrical loud sound that echoed in the silence of the nearly empty waiting area. She finally looked at us. Her gaze swept over Eleanor, then over Dad's tired face, and settled briefly on me, standing quietly in the corner near the entrance. "Sir, if you keep disrupting the process, I will have to ask security to remove you. This is an emergency room, not a fuss room. Take your seat." The word fuss landed like a slap. It implied that Eleanor's pain was theater, that Dad's fear was an unnecessary noise, that we were the problem, not the failing system. I felt the blood boil behind my ears, but I stayed rooted. I was James, the concerned son. I was not James, the state health system's auditor. Not yet. I needed evidence. I needed ironclad specifics. I pulled out my phone discreetly. I started noting everything. Observation 1. The triage protocol for a category yellow patient presenting with persistent, escalating chest pain requires re-evaluation every 30 minutes, maximum. We were at 70 minutes since intake. Observation 2. The triage nurse, Brenda L., clearly violated patient interaction standards, CFR 482.13, by exhibiting overt disrespect and threatening removal rather than escalation of care based on subjective distress reporting by the spouse. Observation 3. A young white woman with a sprained ankle had been admitted and released within the hour. She was laughing on the phone as she left. Her file had been marked priority. Our file remained static. I watched Eleanor shift. She wasn't gasping anymore. That was worse. She was just still. Her eyes were glazed, fixed on the distant ceiling light. Dad noticed the change too. His face drained completely. "Eleanor, honey," he whispered, leaning close. She didn't respond immediately. Just a tiny, shallow rattle in her chest. This was the tipping point. This was no longer neglect. This was negligence that bordered on willful harm. Dad scrambled up, urgency replacing fear. He didn't go to the window this time. He crossed the safety line, pushing through the swinging doors that led directly into the ER corridor. "She needs a doctor now!" His voice was loud, panicked, echoing through the sterile halls. Brenda shrieked, "Security! We have an unauthorized entry. I told you, Mr. Davis! Get back!" A large, tired-looking orderly appeared almost instantly, grabbing Dad by the shoulder. Dad, frail and frightened, didn't resist the physical push backward. "My wife is dying!" Dad cried out, the desperation tearing at the edges of his dignity. The orderly shoved him hard enough that he stumbled, catching himself on the edge of a chair. The movement dislodged the medical intake clipboard from the triage desk. It clattered to the floor, papers scattering everywhere. Brenda cursed under her breath and knelt down to collect the documents, revealing a section of Eleanor's intake form that had been previously hidden. My eyes locked onto the black marker scrawl, not on Eleanor's symptoms, but on the bottom corner, next to the financial information field. In big, careless letters, someone had written one word, underlined twice: Medicaid. The casual cruelty hit me harder than any shouted slur could have. They didn't see pain. They didn't see race directly. They saw poor. They saw unprofitable. They saw burden. That was the key. They were triaging based on perceived financial viability, not actual medical necessity. That was a direct, gross violation of state mandates regarding public health care access, a closure offense. My mother, Eleanor Davis, the woman who had spent 40 years serving the state as a public school teacher, was being allowed to fade because her insurance code didn't flash premium. I stepped away from the wall. My jacket was buttoned tightly. My face was a mask of cold professionalism, learned through years of auditing corruption. I walked calmly to the chair where Dad was now crouched, his hands covering his face, sobbing silently. Dad, look at me, I said, my voice low and steady. He lifted his gaze. His eyes were ruined. They won't help her, James. They won't. They will, I corrected him, straightening my tie. But not in the way they think. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out the small, highly laminated badge. It wasn't flashy, just a gold seal and the words, Office of Public Health Systems Integrity, Lead Investigator, Division 7. I clipped it to my lapel. I glanced over at Brenda, who was still muttering about the scattered papers. She looked up at me, registering the suit, the quiet confidence, perhaps assuming I was a worried lawyer about to file a complaint. She rolled her eyes slightly. I took one last look at my mother, Eleanor. Her breathing was now frighteningly irregular. She needed help 10 minutes ago. I knew this required immediate medical intervention, but first, the institutional rot had to be addressed. The staff needed to know exactly who they had humiliated and why their jobs, their licenses, and this facility were about to cease existing. My quiet fury solidified into a plan so structured and ruthless, it felt like an administrative surgery. I walked toward the triage window, stepping deliberately over the scattered papers of the clipboard, Eleanor's chart, which they had deemed worthless. I stood directly in front of Brenda. She squinted at my badge, confusion etching onto her face. "Can I help you, sir? If you're a lawyer, you'll need to schedule an appointment with administration, not—" I cut her off, my voice loud enough to carry through the waiting area, yet perfectly calm. It was the voice of cold authority. "I am not scheduling an appointment, ma'am. I am initiating an immediate operational cessation." Brenda blinked. "A what?" I leaned in, my shadow falling over her workstation. "I am State Health Systems Lead Investigator James Davis. You are Nurse Brenda L. And as of this precise moment, 16:47 hours, your emergency room is officially under lockdown and immediate closure. You are to cease all non-essential patient handling." Her jaw dropped. "And before you call your supervisors, understand this. Every minute of neglect I have witnessed here in the past 90 minutes, every policy violation you have committed, and the explicit financial discrimination scrawled on my mother's intake chart are now state evidence. I have all of it." I turned, addressing the entire room, the scattered staff, the remaining patients, and the orderly standing rigid by the swinging doors. "I need a fully stabilized gurney, an attending physician, and a full vital panel set up here in the waiting room, immediately. This woman," I pointed back at Eleanor, "is my mother, and she is the priority 1 patient in this facility, effective right now. And if she declines further because you spent 60 seconds debating this order, I assure you, your license will be the very least of your concerns." The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda's harsh red hair seemed to wilt under the sudden spotlight of my authority. The orderly paled, staring at the small golden shield on my lapel. The game was over for them. The reversal had begun. But my mother still wasn't breathing right. I had shut down the ER, but now I had to save Eleanor, right in the heart of the chaos I had just created. This was the true test. The digital clock above the intake desk read 1:37 a.m., 2 hours and 11 minutes since Dad had first gripped his chest in the parking lot. Mom held his hand tightly, rubbing the skin where the IV should have been. Dad was sweating now, a cold, alarming sheen on his forehead. "It's okay, Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias is coming. Just breathe. But it was not okay. A young man, maybe 19, had stumbled in 15 minutes ago, holding his ankle. A sports injury. He was loud, slightly drunk, complaining about missing a party. Nurse Sheila had taken him back instantly. Triage overruled by convenience. Or perhaps simply color. Mom stood again. Her knees ached fiercely. Her voice was thin, but steady with desperation. "Nurse," she called across the counter, her throat tight. "My husband's color is changing. He is pale. We need a doctor immediately." Sheila didn't look up from her clipboard. Her voice was flat, practiced boredom. "Mrs. Johnson, you are in line. We have protocols. Your paperwork is flagged for non-urgent cardiac evaluation. Sit down." "Non-urgent? He can barely draw breath," Mom insisted. A man in scrubs, Dr. Thompson, leaned out from the double doors leading to the examination bays. He looked profoundly annoyed that the quiet was disturbed. He was younger than Elias, arrogant in his posture. He didn't even address Mom. He spoke over her head directly to Sheila. "What is the disruption? If they are causing trouble, security can handle it. This wing is for critical intakes only. We don't run a free clinic for anxiety attacks." Mom froze instantly. The word anxiety hit her like a physical blow. She looked down at Dad, whose breathing was now catching in tiny, desperate, rattling gasps. He wasn't anxious. He was dying. This was the absolute 0 point of care. They weren't just low priority anymore. They were dismissed as liars, exaggerating their pain for attention. It was exactly in that cold, hollow moment of complete helplessness that the heavy automatic emergency doors swung inward. Elias stood there. He didn't rush. He stopped, just inside the threshold, taking in the entire horrifying scene. He saw his mother, shoulders slumped, dignity shattered, standing before a young white doctor who treated her pain like noise. He saw his father, struggling for air, abandoned on a hard plastic chair. He heard Dr. Thompson's contemptuous voice echo off the sterile tile floor. Elias's jaw locked tight. Every memory of his father sacrificing everything, every belief in the integrity of the medical system, shattered instantly into dust. He wasn't Elias Johnson, the worried son, anymore. He was Elias Johnson, the director of state health audits. He walked forward, slowly, deliberately, his footsteps heavy on the tile. His eyes never left the doctor. "Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Thompson was saying, turning back to his paperwork with finality, "if you continue to violate the quiet code, I will have security remove you." Elias reached his mother. He placed one hand firmly on her trembling shoulder, pulling her slightly back from the counter. "Mom," he said, his voice dangerously low, a steady rumble of contained force. "Move away from the counter." His gaze lifted to Dr. Thompson. The doctor finally looked up, saw the new arrival. He saw a well-dressed black man, angry, standing too close to his professional space. "And who precisely are you?" Dr. Thompson snapped, annoyed by the interruption of his authority. Elias took one last deep breath, tasting the stale metallic air of neglect in the waiting room. This was the exact spot where they humiliated his parents. This was the exact spot where the system would now break. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored coat. "I am here to conduct a comprehensive structural inspection of this facility," Elias said, the words clean, precise, and completely out of context for a concerned relative. "Effective immediately." He pulled out the official state identification folder. It was thick, heavy, leather-bound, and marked with the intimidating gold seal of the State Health Commission. He flipped it open, letting the harsh fluorescent light reflect off the badge inside. "Effective immediately," Elias repeated, his voice rising, steel now replacing the quiet hurt. All non-essential services within the emergency department cease until I determine the fitness of this ER to operate. Dr. Thompson stopped smiling. Nurse Sheila's pen froze midair above the triage sheet. The entire waiting room fell into an impossible silence. Elias turned his full attention back to the young doctor who had just dismissed his suffering father as an anxiety attack. "I believe," Elias stated, his voice now ringing clearly through the stunned ward, "that my father requires immediate priority medical attention. And you, doctor," he finished, leaning slightly over the counter, forcing the doctor to look up into his face, "will ensure that he receives it. Now." Elijah pushed through the automatic glass doors of Riverside General's emergency room. The air hit him immediately. It was sterile, yet stale, thick with exhaustion and unspoken panic. He had called ahead. He had told them he was on his way. He had expected to find his parents checked in, at least stabilized. He saw them immediately. They were huddled in the far corner of the expansive waiting room. Ignored. Mama sat upright, her posture stiff with fear, holding Papa's hand tightly. Papa was bent double, his forehead pressed against his knee. His chest movements were shallow and frantic. The thin hospital blanket they had given him lay uselessly on the floor. It had been 2 hours and 27 minutes since they arrived. The fluorescent lights above them seemed to draw the color from their skin, making them look impossibly small and frail. They looked like ghosts of the resilient people he knew. "Mama, Papa." The name scraped his throat. Mama's head snapped up. Relief flooded her face, quickly replaced by a deeper worry. "Elijah, they still haven't called us. Don't cause trouble, baby. They said they are short-staffed." "Short-staffed?" He checked his watch, then his father's weak, rattling pulse. "Papa, look at me." Isaac opened his eyes. They were glazed over with pain. He just shook his head, unable to speak, a silent tear escaping the corner of his eye. That tear felt like a physical strike to Elijah's chest. He didn't need the paperwork in his briefcase to know this was critical. He needed a doctor. Now. He straightened his tie and walked directly to the triage window. Behind the scratched glass, the nurse, Sarah, was laughing with another staff member, sipping from an enormous plastic cup. He waited for her to acknowledge him. She took her time. She finally looked up, her expression a practiced blend of suspicion and annoyance. "Yes? Are you here for intake? My father is Isaac Williams. He was admitted with severe chest pain over 2 hours ago. He is visibly deteriorating. I need him seen immediately." Elijah kept his voice even. He was testing the waters, still acting as the concerned civilian son. She clicked her tongue, navigating a complicated-looking computer screen. "Williams, non-critical cardiac event. Look, we have 5 trauma cases and 2 actual code blues running right now, sir. We prioritize based on need. Your father is stable enough to wait." "Stable?" Elijah gestured to the corner where his father was struggling to breathe. "He is clutching his chest. He can barely talk. What exactly is your definition of critical?" The nurse leaned forward, her voice dropping to a loud theatrical whisper, meant only for him. "Sir, we have limited resources. Frankly, there are people here with actual insurance and verified payment pathways. We only have so many beds open for community care intake. Everyone has to wait their turn." She said community care, like it was a contagious disease. The mask slipped entirely. This wasn't negligence. This was a deliberate policy of classist, likely racist, triage. They had profiled his parents the moment they walked in the door. Old, black, probably poor, certainly not worth the trouble. Elijah felt the cold, hard realization of institutional bias settle in his gut, the same icy feeling he had fought his entire career to dismantle. He looked back at his father. Papa was still struggling. His dignity was being stripped away, minute by agonizing minute. The humiliation was visible. The concerned son vanished. The inspector took his place. Elijah did not respond to the nurse. He took 3 slow steps back, surveying the entire chaotic floor. For 7 years, he had been the regional director for the State Health Facilities Oversight Committee. His job was to enforce the minimum standards of operational safety, clinical staffing, and equitable access. He dealt with compliance reports, not personal trauma. He had never once leveraged his position for a private favor. But this wasn't a favor. This was the mandated protection of vulnerable citizens. His parents were just collateral damage in a system he was supposed to regulate. The irony was scorching. He signed off on their annual certification, and they were letting his own flesh and blood suffer in a crowded corner. He quietly pulled his phone from his suit pocket. He didn't open the camera or make a call. He opened a secure, encrypted internal recording app. He set the timer to loop and placed the phone silently in his breast pocket, the microphone pointing outward. He began his official review. He noted the time of the critical care refusal, 14:52, the name of the refusing staff member, Sarah Jenkins, the stated reason, community care resource limitations. He scanned the rest of the waiting room, observing patterns. He counted the waiting patients and categorized them mentally by race and estimated age. The disparity was stark. The white patients, though fewer in number, seemed to move efficiently through triage. The black and brown families sat stalled, often for hours. Violation assessment, bias in triage protocol, mandate 3.4. He walked past a hallway, observing the flow. A cart of soiled linens was parked directly across from the oxygen supply station. Violation, sanitation and infection control, mandate 6.1. He spotted a fire exit door propped open with a janitor's mop bucket. A stack of old records blocked the path. Violation, public safety and fire code, mandate 1.5. The evidence was piling up quickly, professionally. He was not collecting emotional grievances. He was documenting actionable, certifiable violations that threatened the hospital's operational license. He returned to his parents. He knelt, taking his father's hand again. It was cold. "Papa," Elijah murmured, his voice low and firm. "I'm going to get you a room now. I promise you." He glanced up at the nurse's station, where Sarah was still oblivious, chatting away. Elijah stood up, smoothed his suit, and walked slowly toward a faded sign, reading, "Administrative Access Only." He opened the unmarked door and stepped into the small, poorly lit hallway, closing the door softly behind him. The worried son was gone. Elijah Williams, regional director, was now officially on the clock. He reached into his coat and pulled out the thick packet he kept hidden for emergencies, the one detailing the immediate shutdown protocols. Riverside General Hospital was about to learn the true cost of community care. The air in the treatment room finally held the sharp, clean smell of oxygen. It was an insult. Too little, too late. They had stabilized my father's heart rate. They had pushed the fluids my mother needed hours ago. But they had done it only because I stood there, unmoving, demanding. I was not shouting anymore. My voice was low, flat, and absolute. The kind of sound that demands action, not because it is loud, but because it feels dangerous. They moved my parents to a hallway observation bay, the best they could offer without an official admission, they claimed. "We will keep them here until the primary care physician can review," the resident said, wiping sweat from his brow. He wouldn't meet my eyes. None of them would. "No," I told him. "You will transfer them now to St. Jude's. I want immediate discharge papers and a comprehensive record of the neglect they suffered over the last 6 hours. The resident stiffened. Sir, we can't just discharge stable patients who have refused admission protocols. They didn't refuse protocols, I corrected him softly. They were refused service. Check the triage log. Check the timestamps. Check the notes where the intake nurse logged non-urgent distress on an 82-year-old man with acute pain. I watched his face crumble slightly. He knew. They all knew. The triage nurse, a young white woman named Sarah, had dismissed them instantly. I pulled out the burner phone I carried, the one with the secure encrypted line, and walked toward the quiet corner near the staff lockers. My immediate family was safe. Now, the son had to step back. The inspector had to take control. I dialed the number for Marcus, my chief of staff. "It's me," I said, keeping my voice a near whisper. Marcus knew the sound of my operational voice. It was detached, methodical. It was the voice I used when I had found a deep rot that needed immediate surgical removal. "David, where are you? Everything okay?" he asked, concerned. "I am at Metro General Emergency," I replied. "My parents are recovering from an attempted fatality by bureaucracy and bias. They are stable for now." A heavy silence followed. Marcus understood the weight of that word choice. "I need you to mobilize the immediate response team," I instructed. "I need a forensic audit initiated within the hour. No warning, full team, IT, operations, licensing, public health review. I need the entire chain of command on site by Aero 500 hours. David, that's a full shutdown protocol. What did you see?" I looked across the chaos of the ER. Patients lay on stretchers pushed against walls. Staff hurried past them, faces strained and indifferent. I saw systemic failure, I stated simply. I saw gross negligence prioritized, based on assumed demographics. I saw the deliberate choice to allow two vulnerable citizens to suffer while waiting for a heart attack to prove their worthiness. I tightened my grip on the phone. "This is not an inspection, Marcus. This is a closure. I want the immediate revocation of their federal funding authorization for this entire wing. The state commissioner will fight this, David. You know the politics of closing a major city ER. The politics of allowing elderly black citizens to die on a plastic chair are worse," I retorted. "Prepare the warrant. Cite violations 12A, 14B, and 19E. Immediate failure to provide essential and equitable care. Failure to maintain life-saving standards." I hung up before he could argue further. The wheels of absolute authority were turning now. I slipped the burner phone back into my pocket and smoothed my shirt. I was still just the distraught, tired son. That was the cover. I walked back to the observation bay. My mother was lucid now, though exhausted. She squeezed my hand. "David," she whispered, her voice rough. "You shouldn't have come all this way. You have your job." "My job is right here, Mama," I assured her, resting my hand on her forehead. "Always?" I looked over the charts the nurse had placed on the foot of the bed. They were sloppy, incomplete. Crucial initial vital readings were missing. Medication dosages were scribbled in shorthand that violated protocol. I pulled out a small, heavy black pen, not the cheap plastic one I usually used, and uncapped it slowly. I began to make my own notes on the back of a hospital transfer form, documenting the deficiencies one by one. Missing triage, data, 03-15-04-40, staff response time, excessive. Failure to escalate symptoms based on age and pre-existing conditions, evident. I didn't need to interview anyone formally. The physical evidence of their negligence was piled on the gurney beside my parents. A new resident approached me, clipboard in hand. He looked young, ambitious, and stressed. "Mr. Adams, about the transfer," he began, trying to sound authoritative. "We need to finalize where you want them to go. Also, if you are dissatisfied with the care, you may contact our patient advocacy office during Regular business hours starting at 9 a.m. I nodded slowly, putting my pen away. That's good advice, I said, looking him straight in the eye. My voice was calm, almost soothing. But I don't think I'll be calling patient advocacy. He looked confused. Sir? No, I repeated. I think I'll call licensing and standards instead. He gave a condescending chuckle, a sound that grated on my raw nerves. With all due respect, sir, if every upset relative called them, the ER would shut down, he scoffed. I smiled then, a small, cold, dangerous smile that didn't reach my eyes. That's exactly the point, doctor, I said. I already initiated the order. It's just pending execution. The resident blinked, trying to process the shift in my demeanor, the sudden, quiet authority radiating off me. He looked at my suit, my expensive shoes, my tired, angry face. He still saw only an angry black man demanding too much. He missed the quiet certainty of the state official who had just signed away his hospital's immediate future. I leaned in closer, so only he could hear. Tell Nurse Sarah, who triaged my parents, that I need her personnel file pulled immediately, I instructed, my voice dropping back to that absolute whisper. And tell the department head that by dawn, every bed in this emergency wing will be empty, permanently. Today, this hospital closes its doors to protect the citizens it chose to neglect. His face drained of all color. He realized finally this was not a threat. It was a formal notification. The game was over. The paperwork was already filed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I watched him. There was no joy in this vengeance, only a deep, sickening exhaustion. But my parents were safe. And now, the system that allowed this neglect would pay the required cost. I just had to wait for the sun to rise, and for the sirens of the audit team to announce the end of Metro General's indifference. Dr. Sterling's face had drained of color, a mottled grey canvas of disbelief and crushing realization. He knew the ID badge. Everyone in state healthcare knew the state health inspector's badge. The silence that fell was the sound of a guillotine blade stopping just inches from the ground, waiting for the final push. He tried to recover. He tried to argue authority. This is an abuse of power, sir. You cannot leverage a personal grievance into a regulatory action, he stammered, pulling the clipboard closer like a shield. My voice remained level. No shouting, no drama, only cold, precise application of the law. Dr. Sterling, the negligence displayed towards Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, along with documented violations regarding patient intake protocols 14, 17, and 33, constitute sufficient grounds for immediate action. I stepped back, allowing the camera crew I had quietly signaled to record his reaction clearly. This isn't personal leverage. This is regulatory duty, I corrected him calmly. The lives of my parents were endangered by systematic prejudice and medical disregard within this public institution. That is the definition of a regulatory failure. The administrative chief of staff, a woman named Ms. Hayes, who had dismissed my initial query an hour earlier, burst through the door, clutching a phone. She had heard the whispers, seen the uniformed enforcement officers beginning to filter into the waiting area. Her tone shifted instantly, from stern executive to desperate supplicant. Mr. Harrison, please. We can address this internally. We can reorganize the triage immediately. We can offer you assurance. We will fire anyone responsible right now. She was watching her facility burn, not in fire, but in paperwork and public reputation. I looked at her, remembering how her eyes had slid past my father when he was struggling to breathe in the wheelchair. You won't fire anyone, Ms. Hayes, I told her. I will, by shutting down the department that allowed this culture to flourish. I handed the enforcement team lead the thick stack of papers. The official order was stamped and dated, activated the moment I had confirmed their failure to stabilize my mother. Effective immediately, the St. Jude Regional Emergency Department is under regulatory closure. All incoming ambulance traffic is to be diverted to neighboring facilities. The sound the ER made then was sharp, collective gasp of panic. It wasn't the sound of fire alarms. It was the sound of institutional power grinding to a halt. Dr. Sterling tried one final appeal, his voice cracking. "We have patience! We have critical cases here, Mr. Harrison. You can't just stop treating people." I turned to him, the first hint of my true, stored exhaustion showing on my face. "You stopped treating people, doctor. You stopped treating the ones you decided weren't worth your time, your focus, or your humanity." I pointed toward the corner, where the nurses had ignored my father's quiet coughs just hours before. "Every staff member here is ordered to complete the immediate safe discharge or internal transfer of all existing patients within the next 6 hours. Only life-sustaining measures for already admitted patients will continue. No new cases will be admitted until an external audit is complete, and this department is restructured from the ground up." The enforcement officers began their work immediately, directing nurses to the diversion phone lines. Chaos was contained by cold professional order. Miss Hayes began to weep, quiet sobs of professional ruin. She understood that this wasn't just a fine. This was the end of careers, the shattering of the hospital's prestige, all because of two elderly black people they deemed low priority. I walked away from the ensuing chaos, following the chief nurse who was now rushing my parents back into a secure, monitored stabilization room. The room they should have been in 3 hours ago. My parents were pale but stable. My mother gave my hand a weak squeeze. She didn't know the full scale of the explosion I had just detonated outside the door, but she knew the fight was won. I stood over them, watching the monitors beep a reassuring rhythm. The air in this small room was safe, finally, but my job wasn't over. The closure was issued, but the why had to be made public, undeniable, and permanent. I had shut down the emergency room that tried to kill my parents. Now, I had to ensure that the people responsible for that culture never practiced medicine again. The state official in me had executed the closure. Now, the son had to finalize the justice. I stepped back out into the hall, ready to face the administrators who were now huddled desperately, trying to find a loophole in my enforcement order. I saw the lead enforcement officer approach me, holding a small notepad. "Mr. Harrison, the staff are cooperating, but the legal team for St. Jude is asking for an immediate injunction against the order. They are claiming selective, racially motivated enforcement by the state health inspector." I took the notepad. I knew they would fight. They always fought. They always hid behind lawyers and bureaucracy. But I was the bureaucracy this time. "Tell their legal team that the full report, detailing the systematic triage discrimination and the specific negligent actions taken against Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, will be released to the press and to the Department of Justice in exactly 1 hour." I watched the officer relay the message. That time frame would give them just enough time to realize that fighting me would mean certain public suicide. I needed to make one more phone call, not as the inspector, but as the son. I needed the world to know exactly what this hospital had done. The clock was ticking. The ER was silenced. But the true story was just beginning to roar. The administrator, Mr. Davies, was purple. He sputtered about protocol and jurisdiction. He tried to pull rank, even though I clearly outranked him in that moment. "You can't just close a major public hospital wing," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "The governor, the funding." I held up the official seal on the document. It was stamped in wet, unforgiving ink. I held up my badge, letting the light reflect off the state emblem. "I am not closing a wing, Mr. Davies. I am enacting a mandatory, immediate cessation of service for the entire facility." My voice was quiet. It felt like I was reading a death sentence to a machine. Effective 17 was ours, I stated, looking at my watch. This hospital is designated Code Red for systemic failure and patient endangerment. I looked directly at the hospital's legal counsel, who had just arrived, pale and sweating. Non-compliance with this immediate shutdown order is a federal offense, punishable by immediate revocation of all state operating licenses and potentially severe criminal penalties for obstruction of justice. Dr. Thorne, the arrogant physician who had waved away my father, finally understood the scope of the catastrophe he had created. He leaned against a sterile white wall, his body shaking slightly. "This is extreme, Marcus," he whispered. He tried to use my first name, a desperate attempt at personal connection. "My name is Inspector Reed, to you, Doctor." I walked past the chaos and found my parents' temporary holding area. They were still shaken, still exhausted from the ordeal, but they were stable. They saw the panicked nurses moving files, the shouting from the administrators, and the growing sense of dread in the air. "Son," my mother whispered, her hand finding mine. Her grip was weak but sure. "What did you do?" "I made sure you get the care you paid for your entire lives, Mama," I told her softly. "The care you were entitled to." I had already called in the transport team from a neighboring facility, a private clinic in the next county, highly rated, where I knew they would be treated with dignity. They arrived discreetly, bypassing the main chaotic entrance. A doctor I trusted implicitly was leading the transfer. "Transport priority 1, I instructed the team lead. "Highest level of comfort, quiet and surveillance." As they wheeled my parents out, their gurneys passed Nurse Kelly. She was not moving paperwork. She was hysterically weeping, pleading with a junior member of the hospital's burgeoning legal defense team. She saw my parents, and then she saw me. Her face twisted in accusation. The tears seemed to dry instantly, replaced by fierce resentment. "You destroyed us over a perceived slight," she hissed. "We are caregivers." I stopped the transport gurney just long enough to meet her eyes. "No, Nurse Kelly," I corrected her. My voice was low, measured. "You are gatekeepers. You judged two souls based on the color of their skin and the perceived size of their wallet. You failed them. The state failed them through your inaction." I nodded to the transport team, and they moved my parents efficiently down the hallway towards safety and proper care. The official regulatory process was relentless. My own team of state health inspectors, the people who actually reported to me, swept through the facility like a cleanup crew after a devastating hurricane. We sealed off pharmacies, locked administrative offices, and documented every single violation that came up in the facility's history logs. The sheer volume of negligence reports we uncovered in those short hours was sickening. It wasn't just the racist dismissal of my parents. This place was a systemic disaster waiting to happen, fueled by unchecked arrogance and institutionalized bias against those they deemed unworthy. My parents' injustice was merely the specific key that unlocked the vault of rot. Davies kept making frantic phone calls to his lawyers, to his political contacts, to anyone he thought could override a state inspector general's mandate. Every single call ended the same way, with him hanging up, staring numbly at the floor. No one could or would intervene. The bureaucracy of an emergency shutdown, when executed correctly, is swift and absolutely merciless. We did not miss a single step. I received a text message an hour later. My mother. "Resting well, son. They are being so kind." That simple assurance was my reward, not the screaming, not the chaos, just the safety of my parents. I returned to the eerily quiet ER lobby. Most patients had been rerouted. The staff who remained were either packing legally required files or waiting for the official police escort off the premises. Dr. Thorne approached me one last time. He wasn't begging now. He looked utterly broken. What happens to us, Inspector? To our careers? Our licenses? I signed the final closure sheet, stamping it with the official date and time, 17 Akkosk hours. The hospital was officially non-operational. You will face civil lawsuits, criminal inquiries for systemic negligence, and a complete review of your licensing board status, doctor. I looked directly at his badge, the one that proclaimed him a healer. You chose profit and prejudice over your Hippocratic oath. Today, you are simply accountable. My job on site was technically done. The facility was locked down. The legal battle, however, was just beginning. This was the regulatory victory. The final victory had to be moral, public, and absolute. As I walked out into the cold night air, the media vans were already lining the street outside the property line. The bright television lights illuminated the imposing structure of the hospital, now just a massive empty tomb of their injustice. I had shut down the ER ward. Now, I needed to make sure the entire city knew why. The silence that followed my order was not disbelief. It was paralyzing dread. Dr. Albright's face went white, the color draining away, as if pulled by gravity, leaving behind a map of stunned horror. "This is absurd, Mr. Hayes," the board's chief legal counsel stammered, adjusting his expensive tie. "You cannot issue a directive to cease operations based on a single isolated incident of perceived staff misconduct. We need due process. We need a hearing before an impartial body." I leaned forward slowly, resting my weight on the mahogany table. The meeting room suddenly felt very cold, despite the temperature outside. The due process was the 3 hours my mother spent shivering in a hallway chair. I said, my voice low but cutting. The due process was the 8 minutes my father stood here, begging for basic human decency, while your staff mocked his broken English and dismissed their pain as typical of their demographic. I stood up. My team, positioned discreetly in the back of the room, began moving, preparing the official posting notices and coordinating with the externals agencies. They were efficient, trained for systemic crisis, trained for failure. "Counselor," I addressed the lawyer directly, meeting his terrified gaze. "The directive is not based on perceived staff misconduct. It is based on a systemic failure to maintain standards of care, cleanliness, and, critically, equitable service, as outlined in Sections 4A and 9G of the State Health Code." I held up a thick folder filled with tabs. This folder contains sworn testimonies from 3 non-management nurses and 2 auxiliary staff members, people who saw the blatant negligence and institutional bias firsthand and who were brave enough to speak up. I dropped the folder on the table. The thud was loud, final. "You want due process? The process is underway. The immediate danger to public health mandates immediate action. The denial of essential, timely care to Elias and Sarah Hayes, my parents, was the final, catastrophic data point that necessitated this unprecedented closure." The lawyer reached automatically for his phone, his hand shaking. "Don't bother with the injunction, counselor," I warned him, almost gently. "I wrote the regulations on emergency closure protocols for this state 2 years ago. We are watertight. Operations cease immediately. All non-critical patients must be safely transferred within 4 hours. Within the hour, the organized chaos began. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a precise, devastating wind down. State police arrived, not to arrest anyone, but to secure the facility and ensure the swift, safe transfer of all remaining patients to neighboring compliant hospitals. The sight was surreal. Ambulances lined up outside the ER entrance, but instead of bringing people in for care, they were taking them away. Every siren wailing in the afternoon air was a funeral song for the institution that had failed its basic mission. I watched Nurse Kelly from the second-floor observation window. She was visibly distraught, trying to collect her personal belongings, her movements jerky with shock. She was finally realizing that her paycheck, and perhaps her license, was tied directly to the monumental systemic arrogance she had embodied that morning. She caught my eye once. There was no defiance left, only terrified recognition. She saw me not as the man whose mother she had refused to triage, but as the inevitable consequence itself. Dr. Albright, the chief of staff, fared worse. He was escorted out by his own security team after refusing to cooperate with the transfer protocol, yelling incoherently about his quarter century of service and his reputation. "You ruined me, Hayes! You used your office for spite!" he screamed, his voice raw, echoing across the rapidly emptying waiting room. I walked toward him slowly, stopping just out of arm's reach. The chairs where my parents had waited were cold and empty. "Dr. Albright," I said, ensuring my voice carried clearly over the noise of the evacuation. "I did not ruin you. You ruined yourself the moment you prioritized procedure over a human life. You ruined yourself when you cultivated a culture where the lives of people like my parents were considered disposable overhead." I didn't allow him the dignity of a response. I just looked him in the eye, straight through the glass of his privilege. "Spite is petty, doctor. This is not spite. This is justice. This is the calculated consequence of believing that some people matter less than others." I stayed on site until the last patient was safely transferred. Then I drove across town to the private, specialized cardiac center, the exact kind of facility they were told they couldn't afford. My mother, Sarah, and my father, Elias, were finally comfortable, safe, and being treated with the genuine dignity they deserved. I visited them late that night. My mother was sitting up, sipping water, looking tired but calm. My father, Elias, was holding her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles rhythmically. "You look exhausted, son," father said, his voice soft, heavy with meaning. "It was a necessary day, Dad." He looked at me, a profound understanding settling in his eyes. "Did you do what you had to do?" I nodded, resting my briefcase against the wall. "The hospital is closed, fully suspended operations. The investigation into institutional bias is ongoing, but that wing won't treat another patient until they fundamentally restructure their leadership and training and demonstrate compliance." Mother sighed, closing her eyes briefly. "Marcus, I didn't want anyone to lose their job because of us." "They didn't lose their jobs because of you, Mama," I corrected her, firmly but gently. "They lost their positions because they failed to do their jobs. They lost their access to power because they abused it. This wasn't about revenge, Mother. This was about setting the value of our lives publicly, permanently." I sat beside her bed and took their hands, one in each of mine. Their hands, worn and strong from decades of work, of building a life where they were always told they had to be twice as good to get half as far. "When I was waiting in that hallway, watching your father beg," she whispered, her eyes filling with fresh, quiet tears, "I felt so small. I felt invisible, like we didn't deserve the air we breathed in that expensive, polished room." "You are never invisible, Mama," I insisted, squeezing her hand. "Not anymore. Not when I'm here." The closure sent powerful shockwaves through the entire state medical community. It was unprecedented. The news coverage focused immediately on the state health inspector, Marcus Hayes, the man who shut down a major city hospital over alleged racist neglect of his own parents. For days, the old arrogant voices tried to shout down the truth, crying foul play, accusing me of unethical conflicts of interest. But the evidence, compiled meticulously by my team and confirmed by the immediate testimonies of the ethical whistleblowers, was irrefutable. They had denied essential, life-saving care based on perceived class and race. They had let my mother suffer, The hospital did not reopen quickly. They spent millions fighting in court to reverse the injunction. But the state health department held firm. The conditions for reopening were stringent: a complete overhaul of management, mandatory bias training developed by external specialists, and the establishment of an independent patient advocacy board with veto power over hiring and critical staffing decisions. It took 7 months of emptiness, where institutional arrogance had thrived. Dr. Albright was quietly dismissed, his medical license flagged for gross negligence. Nurse Kelly received a severe sanction, making it nearly impossible for her to work in a reputable public-facing medical capacity again. The cost to that system was enormous, measured in dollars and reputation, but the gain, the dignity restored to Elias and Sarah Hayes, and by extension, to every person who felt minimized by that system, was immeasurable. I stood outside the newly reopened hospital months later. It had a new name, a new CEO, and crucially, a mandatory signage policy displayed prominently at the entrance. Equitable care is law. Zero tolerance for bias. It wasn't a perfect victory. Systemic racism is a deep-seated cancer that requires constant vigilance, not a single surgery. But we had carved out a piece of the rot. We proved that the rules apply to everyone, especially those who think their power exempts them from humanity. My parents recovered fully. They were back home, tending their garden, laughing again. They never talked about the humiliation of that night much, but the quiet pride in my father's eyes told me everything. He was finally seen. They were finally valued. I learned a deep, cold truth that year. Justice does not always look like an immediate consequence. Sometimes it looks like patience, paperwork, and the quiet, terrible power of knowing the system better than the people trying to break it. I closed the folder, putting away the final documents on the case. I am Marcus Hayes, and I learned that the greatest weapon against arrogance is not anger. It is procedure. It is the law. And when they refuse to see your humanity, you simply force them to respect your authority. The closure was complete. The lesson was delivered, dignity restored. It was finished.